Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jenny Beal, and this is the Living in Not Knowing section of the Awareness podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Donald Hoffman. Hello, Don. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this podcast.
Thank you, Jenny, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So some of you will know Don from the End of Seeking conference or from his videos, but for those of you who don't, I'll start by giving a brief summary of his background. So he's a professor of cognitive sciences at the University of California, Irvine. His research interests include evolutionary psychology, visual perception, and consciousness. And he's the author of over 100 scientific papers on these subjects. His most recent book, The Case Against Reality, Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, provides an introduction to his theory of conscious realism. And if you enjoy this podcast, I do recommend this book. You don't need any scientific background to understand it. It's accessible to everyone. And it's also great fun while making a lot of serious points that are relevant to the non-dual teaching. So to start with, Don, what led you to become interested in consciousness and to develop a theory of consciousness?
Well, partly it was just being a human being and being naturally curious, but there were some specific things in my background. I was raised in a family that was at once into religion. My parents were into fundamentalist Christianity. My dad ended up being the associate pastor and pastor of a small congregation. But they were also into the sciences. My dad had a master's in chemistry, my mom a bachelor in biology, and so they were, interested in science as well as religion. And so, but the two seemed to conflict. At least the fundamentalist Christianity that I was raised in seemed to conflict with the science I was getting at school. For example, about the age of the universe and so forth. So at some point, I decided that I wanted to understand what was going on here. And it seemed to me that there was a mechanistic view of humans from the science side of things that in some sense were machines. And from the spiritual side, it seemed like maybe we're not machines, but something more like a soul or a spirit. And I decided I wanted to find out for myself what was the best understanding that I could get. And I decided the best thing I could do was to try to figure out what could artificial intelligence do. If I could build an AI that was just as good as any human, then maybe we're just machines. So what can machines do? And that AI seemed to be the right way to find out what could machines do. And so, but I also wanted to understand human psychology and human neurobiology. So I ended up at MIT in two departments, in the brain and cognitive sciences department, and also in the artificial intelligence lab. So I was doing both things. I was working in AI, working on specific aspects of AIs, visual perception in particular, and then learning the neuroscience. And so I became very interested in these issues go very, very deep. And so the more I probed it, the more down the rabbit hole you go. And so I got very interested in consciousness as a result, because it's just not a simple problem. And so I've been studying it ever since, actually, for more than 40 years now.
Right. I mean, most people listening to this podcast will have come across the spiritual teaching that the world as we perceive it is unreal. And your book also gives very good reasons for that, based on the theory of evolution, which is a well-established scientific theory. But what about our emotions? Obviously, machines don't have emotions as far as we know, but they must also be connected with survival and procreation. Are they also unreal?
Emotions.
Yes.
So first I'll talk just about the word real for just a second, because we tend to use it in two different senses. And so I want to distinguish the two different senses that we use. Sometimes we use the word real to mean that something exists even if it's never perceived. or even when it's not perceived. So that's one notion of real. So we might call that, objectively real. But then there's also another sense in which, my headache, if I have a headache right now, well, that headache, of course, wouldn't exist if it weren't perceived. I mean, the headache exists in my perceptions. So it's not objectively real in the sense I just described, but it certainly is subjectively real in the sense that if you told me I didn't have a real headache, I might be cross with you and say, no, I really do need a couple aspirins and so forth. So there's two different senses of real that we have to distinguish here. And our emotions are certainly real in the subjective sense, right? They're real experiences. And they're apparently, one can argue about whether they're real in an objective sense, right? So some of my colleagues who are studying emotions with artificial intelligence might claim that if you have the right kind of physical dynamics, then then that will necessarily be an emotion, and you might then say, well, then they're claiming that there's this objective notion of an experience, that a headache is a real thing in an objective sense, that it would exist. Well, we could say it exists, and we would have independent evidence that it exists, even if we weren't, experiencing it ourselves. I don't think that my colleagues are persuasive on this point, but I do just bring this point out, that that's a kind of debate that goes on. So my own view is that emotions are surely real in the subjective sense, and but not in the objective sense. But then I also don't think that physical objects are real in the objective sense either. I don't think the sun exists when it's not perceived. So I'm not in any way putting lower value on the emotions. I'm saying that they're just as real as the sun, but the sun doesn't exist in the objective sense any more than our experiences do. So you can see it's an interesting issue, and it's more complicated. When we talk about it, we tend to just assume we know by real. So as soon as you start making these nuances about real, then it becomes a very interesting topic.
Yes, so it's as real and as unreal as the sun, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I was trying to think if there's any way we can escape from what you call the headset in your interface theory of perceptions. In other words, that we see the world normally through something that resembles a virtual reality headset. We don't see what really is, if indeed anything really is. But is there any way we can escape from that, not just theoretically through mathematical theories or whatever? But I couldn't come up with anything, because, if you take drugs, then that seems like just another virtual reality headset. If you have a deep spiritual experience of no mind or consciousness without objects, which really changes the way you see the world, and it can do. But once again, when the world comes back into view, albeit differently, that still seems to be another headset. What would be your view on that?
Right. Can we ever completely let go of the headset?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, first I'll just say that it's remarkable that the two main pillars of modern science, evolution by natural selection, as well as quantum field theory with Einstein's theory of gravity, both tell us that space and time are not fundamental. So this is something that spiritual traditions have been saying for millennia. But science, the two main scientific theories now in science agree that space and time, and therefore the contents of space and time, are not fundamental, and therefore I argue that there's a good metaphor for them. As you said, these are not the reality; they're more like a virtual reality headset to some deeper reality beyond. And so you're right. Even if we, so we're not seeing the reality as it is, we're just seeing a virtual reality. And that's why I was saying that the sun exists when you look, and it doesn't exist when you don't look. So it's like if you're a virtual reality headset on, you're playing a game like Grand Theft Auto, right? And you look over and you see a red Ferrari. Well, you render the red Ferrari, you create it in your experience when you look, and then you delete it when you look away. So that's why I'm saying that the sun is the same thing. I look when I look at the sun, albeit briefly, uh, then it exists, and when I don't look, I don't render it anymore, and it doesn't exist. So that's the sense in which I would say it's a headset. And I would agree with you that when we take drugs like DMT and so forth, or psilocybin, uh, the nature of our experience can be transformed fundamentally. And it could either be that we're just sort of screwing things up, or it could be deeper. It could be but it would be another headset, as you said. It would seem to be another headset, and I would agree with you that when we're in meditation and letting go of all experiences, any particular experiences, it's not clear then, because we're sort of still aware of something that would just be perhaps a more sparse or spare headset. But perhaps, and this is speculation, when we go in the deepest sleep, where we have no remembrance of right, on the assumption that we are consciousness, so on that assumption that we are conscious beings, and consciousness is fundamental, it's possible that in those deepest stages of sleep, we completely let go of all headsets. But then there's nothing to remember when we put the headset back on. And so we just, to our minds, it was nothing. But maybe in reality, it is us being the unlimited intelligence, or the unlimited consciousness beyond any headset. But I'm just speculating. I don't know. That's hopefully, maybe as we get more mathematical models of consciousness, we can say something more precise.
Yes, I mean, I guess really mind sort of requires time, in a sense, for its functioning. So if time doesn't really exist, if time is just in the headset, then it seems impossible to escape. But as you say, in deep sleep, there is no sense of time. That's in a way what disappears, which is why you haven't got a memory, I suppose.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, and I also agree that time, in the work that we're doing on consciousness, and the headset, it looks like time is not a necessary attribute of this deeper modeling of consciousness that we're doing. That we can have a dynamics of consciousness without an arrow of time. Like in physics, there's an arrow because entropy keeps increasing with time. In some sense, you define the increasing direction of time by the increasing arrow of entropy. But we can have dynamics of consciousness in which the entropy does not increase. With the steps of the dynamics. But when you look at that dynamics and take a projection of it, so when you project it by something called conditional probability, for example, you can prove that the dynamics that you see by projection, so you've lost a little information about the true dynamics. It's a projection. You lose information in a projection. And that dynamics will have an arrow of time. But that arrow of time is an artifact of the projection. It's not an insight into the true nature of the thing that you were observing. And I suspect that that's true of almost everything that we perceive, that in some sense, the arrow of time and all the other things that we perceive are not necessarily an insight into the nature of this deeper reality, but they're sort of artifacts of a projection from that deeper reality. And so it's really hard to know what of what we perceive is a good indication of the deeper reality, and what is, like time, just an artifact.
So the kind of emergent properties of a deeper process, in other words.
That's right. We tend to want to assume that what we're seeing is a good pointer to the deeper nature of reality. But as we actually explore possible models of the deeper reality, we recognize mathematically that it's quite possible that many of the things that we perceive in our interface are not to be taken as good indicators of the true nature of this deeper reality. For example, if you look very closely at your computer screen, you'll see all these little pixels. Well, that's an artifact of the headset, or
Yeah.
of the mechanism that you're using, the
Mm.
hardware that you're using. It's not, those pixels aren't necessarily an insight into, for example, I look really closely at your image on Zoom right now. I would see little pixels on your face. Well, but that's not anything to do with the pixels I see have nothing to do with your face. They're really a
Yeah.
property just of my headset. And so we have to be very, very careful, in science, and also in just our casual thinking about things. What we assume from our experience is going to be an insight into the nature of reality may or may not be. It may be an artifact. So this is why it's more tricky than you think, and so we have to be very, very careful.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to hear more about your views on artificial intelligence, because I've been playing with an AI system called ChatGPT, and I'm totally amazed at what it can do. Not just its knowledge base, but also its creativity and its sort of inbuilt ethics. It seems completely amazing. I mean, for example, as well as just playing, actually, I used it to explain some of the maths in the paper you sent me, and it did an absolutely brilliant job. Which
Really?
is, it was absolutely astounding. I mean, it gave me enough to carry on. I haven't carried on to the end of the paper yet, but I'm confident that I can, as a result of what it's told me. And that would have been very hard to do via Wikipedia, which is my usual source for stuff, or textbooks, even, because it was an area of maths that I'd never studied. So that was incredible. But a friend of mine, I told a couple of friends about it, and one of them asked it to write poetry and also a script for a play, and it's really creative. She also asked it to rewrite a scene from Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth finds a wonderful soap which gets rid of the blood on her fingers, and it did the most astounding job at that. And the other friend I told about it is now using it seriously for her work to write reports and emails. It's completely astonishing. So, I mean, obviously there are ways in which AI computationally can outperform human minds, but are there any ways in which human minds will always be able to outperform AI?
Well, that's a great question, and I think it's also related to the question of, are the AIs really conscious or not,
Mm.
as well. And so for me, those are two separate questions. So on the outperforming humans, I agree that what they're doing right now is astounding, and we haven't seen anything yet. They will be having access to terabytes after terabytes of data that we couldn't ever digest, and computational power that will eventually dwarf even the 100 billion or 86 billion neurons in our brains and so forth.
Mm.
So at some point, just like we have cars that can go faster than we could ever run, and we just have learned to accept that, we will have machines that will beat us at every intellectual endeavor. And so I have little doubt that there will be no intellectual endeavor in which we will be able to compete, in short order. I still remember just a few years ago, maybe 15 years ago, people thinking that Go, the game of Go, was going to be forever beyond the
Yes,
AIs,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And because the
And it's
search space.
not.
No, they trounce us hands down. So
Mm.
all the naysayers have been shown to be wrong repeatedly. So in terms of intelligence, um, of that kind will be outwitted, and we already are. Most of us are already outwitted. There are very few holdouts in any small areas right now. But the other issue, though, about consciousness is a bit more subtle.
Mhm.
Many of my friends and colleagues who are studying AIs from a physicalist framework, I would say 90+% of them assume that consciousness is just a product of complex physical systems and their interactions, for example,
Yes.
nervous systems. And so they would argue that an AI with the right kind of complexity will also generate consciousness. So not just intelligence, intelligent, behavior and intelligent speech and so forth, but real life consciousness. Because you could imagine, for example, a dumb program that plays tic-tac-toe and beats me. But you might not say, well, just because it can beat Hoffman at tic-tac-toe doesn't mean that it's intelligent. I'm sorry, it could be more intelligent than Hoffman, but it's not conscious.
Mhm.
And so, but they want to make the stronger claim that it's not only, in practical terms more intelligent than us, but in reality it's conscious. And there I think it's a different story. There I would disagree with them. I think that physical systems like neurons and brains and all chips and circuits and software don't even exist when they're not perceived. Those entities are simply icons in our headset, and they're not independent realities. And so the idea that, and by the way, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't study neuroscience. To the contrary, it means that neuroscience is far more complicated than we thought. We need more money for neuroscience because we thought there's 86 billion neurons and all their connections, and that's what we need to study. That's the reality. No, that's just a gloss on reality. The reality is far more complicated, but all we've got is the gloss. And so we have to study the 86 billion neurons and all their trillions of synapses and so forth, not because that's the final reality, but because it's the best pointer we have to a much more complicated and deeper reality that projects down to those billions of neurons and trillions of synapses. So I think that the idea that AI is conscious in the sense that most of my colleagues would claim, that unconscious circuits and software are giving rise to consciousness, I think that's false. Now, on the other hand, we do know that there is a correlation between what we call physical systems like brains and conscious experiences. And you can, if you cooled my brain sufficiently, you would find evidence that I'd lost consciousness, and so forth.
Mm.
Or a stroke could, or death. So there is a correlation between our access to consciousness and icons like brains in our headset. And so there's the clear question of what is the relationship between consciousness and the icons in our headset, and could AIs be conscious in some deeper sense, not in the sense that circuits create consciousness, but could circuits be pointing to, could they be icons in our headset that are pointing to a deeper consciousness? So for example, just to make clear what I'm saying, right now I'm looking at you on a Zoom screen. So what I'm literally just seeing are pixels on my screen. And some of the pixels, I see a green plant, and then I see a wall, and I see a bit of a chair behind you. The chair pixels that I'm seeing are giving me no insight into any consciousness at all. None. Right? They're inanimate as far as I'm concerned. But there are pixels in the middle of the screen that corresponding to your face that give me some insight into consciousness as to whether I'm making sense, whether you disagree or agree. So I'm getting some insight into your consciousness, but from those pixels, but not from the pixels of the plant. So does that mean that certain pixels are creating consciousness? No. Does it mean that certain pixels are conscious? That the Jenny face pixels are conscious, but the chair pixels are not? That's silly. Pixels are pixels, and they're neither conscious nor unconscious. They're just pixels. However, certain pixels provide a portal into the genuine consciousness that is Jenny. And so it's not that the pixels are conscious, but they're providing a portal into consciousness. So they're an interface that has opened a portal into a realm of consciousness behind the interface, whereas the pixels corresponding to the chair are not opening a portal, that, at least not a portal that's accessible to Hoffman or useful to Hoffman. So there's a different kind of question here than, instead of asking, do AIs properly programmed create consciousness from their unconscious circuits and software, which is the standard view, change the question. Could we develop technologies that perhaps look like AIs that would be genuine new portals into consciousness? And I think the answer is yes. I think once we understand our space-time headset well enough, we should be able to reverse engineer it and rejig it to open up new portals. All right, we do have one technology right now to create new portals into consciousness. And that technology is having kids. Right? Every time we have kids, it takes a while, right? It's a long process, but eventually we get new portals into consciousness. So if we can reverse engineer that technology, then we might be able to speed it up, right? Because that's it works. It's low tech, but it works, and it opens up new portals. If we understand it, maybe we could understand how to create new portals into consciousness, and maybe that new technology might look like circuits and software, but it would not be that unconscious circuits and software are creating consciousness. It's rather that we're learning how to rejig our interface to open new portals into the pre-existing consciousness. So you can see the answers are long because the issues are deep, and the standard views are alluring but misleading.
Yes, yeah. It seems actually quite similar to something Francis Lucille says. He uses different language because what you call the headset he calls mind, and he says mind doesn't understand anything. Mind is just a biocomputer. Only awareness understands, and understanding is outside of mind. So awareness and consciousness being the same in his view, and that seems to be something similar, I think, to what you're saying. It's there's a portal from mind into consciousness, but it's only the understanding ultimately resides in consciousness.
Yes. Given those translations between our language, absolutely, I would agree. Yeah, the notion of understanding, I think he's using understanding in a very, very deep sense. I mean, there's some sense in which you could say that even the Chat GPT understood you because it responded appropriately when you asked it questions, right? It responded in a way that you felt was appropriate. So there is some lesser sense, perhaps, in which you could say it understood you.
Yes.
And I think that Francis Lucille may be talking about a very much deeper sense of understanding than that one. So as you can see, once again, I'm very, very careful about terms. One of the things we learn in science is to use all of our words very, very carefully and precisely, mathematically precisely, if wherever possible, simply because many of the disagreements we have are not disagreements of substance. They're disagreements because we simply misunderstand the language that the other person is using. And so often in science, the standard is, give me a mathematically precise statement of what you're saying. Then there'll be a minimal risk of misunderstanding what you really mean. And so that's why I always want to be careful about the terms we use. So make these nuances between the different versions of understanding we might have, or the difference word real, what the meanings of real are, because that's really one of the lessons we learn from science. The more precise you can be, the more problems you're going to avoid of the uninteresting type of problems, and the more you will see the more interesting and genuine problems that need to be solved. So ultimately, I would love to have the notion of understanding, for example, that those two different notions I just mentioned, like the understanding that ChatGPT seems to have is not nearly as profound as the one I think that Francis Lucille is talking about. Is there So what I would love as a scientist is there some way of cashing out the word understanding with mathematical precision that shows it's like a slider. So here's the lower levels of the mathematical notion of understanding, where chat GPT counts as understanding. When we go to these deeper, more complicated notions of understanding, at some point, no, it doesn't, and Francis Lucille is right, it couldn't. I would love to have a mathematically precise notion of that, because you can see what I don't want to do is just stop and say yes, and without pointing out, but there's something very, very rich here that we don't understand about understanding itself, about these different shades of it. So so my attitude is never assume I know, always question, even the very words that we're using, and realize that with every question, there are vistas of fun and exploration that open up. And it also is an antidote to dogmatism. We tend to say, well, we use these words that are loosely or not well defined. We think we know precisely what we're saying, and then we disagree with people that aren't using the words. And so we get all these uninteresting disagreements and then uninteresting and pointless dogmatisms, when my attitude is it should be more like, okay, question everything that I'm saying and all the words I'm using, and question my own understanding of them, and ask, is there a more precise understanding and so it means never assume I know, always assume I don't know, and there's more to probe. And that's, I think, the right spiritual attitude, frankly, as well as the right scientific attitude.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Totally agree. That leads me to another question about sentient and insentient beings, and whether that concept has any validity outside the headset. And I guess that's related to the same problem. Can AI become sentient in a way, isn't it?
That's right. It's related. So sentient, for example, I'll to cash out just a little bit. I'll say that to be sentient would be to have experiences like a headache, or this taste of chocolate, or the sound of a harp or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. And have them as genuine experiences. And my guess is that in the mathematical model that I'm working on of consciousness, it uses something that we call conscious agents as sort of these units of consciousness. And when agents interact, they combine and form new agents in ways that we can discuss if you'd like. And there's nothing in the mathematics that suggests that human kinds of sentience are the only or even special. That this theory allows for countless varieties of sentience, almost all of which humans have never experienced and can't even imagine. And by that, for example, I mean that if I ask you to imagine a specific color that you've never seen before, right? Nothing happens. Right? I try, nothing happens. But we know that there are women who are so-called tetrafemmes. So most of us have only 3 kinds of color receptors, colloquially called red, green, and blue, technically long, medium, and short wavelength photoreceptors. And so most of us have a certain range of color experiences. But these women with 4 photoreceptors, there's good empirical evidence. Some colleagues of mine who've been studying this have some very interesting evidence that these women not only have more photoreceptors, but they have a new dimension of color experience, and they make finer color distinctions than the rest of us. So there's good empirical evidence that these women are seeing colors that no man could ever see or even imagine, and only a few women can do it. It turns out only women can have these tetrafemme things due to genetics different between men and women. So there's evidence that there are women who have experiences of color that Hoffman will never even be able to imagine. And that's just a little baby step into this whole world of the work I'm doing clearly entails that, or assumes, I guess, that there are countless experiences that I've never had and can't even concretely imagine. We can write down mathematics to specify these possibilities, and so the math can go where my own sentience cannot, which is really quite
Yes.
interesting. So it can help my understanding, perhaps in the sense that we were talking about, the deeper
Mm.
Lucille, Francis Lucille kind of sense of understanding. It can help me to understand the limits of my own sentience, and the possibility of profound realms of other experiences that I can't even concretely imagine. So that's a long answer of yes. Are there potentially sentient beings whose sentience is very, very different from ours, utterly? And my own feeling, for what it's worth, is most of us are quite enamored with our world. Space and time is complicated. The universe is billions of light years across. It has trillions of, at least hundreds of billions of stars, or trillions of stars and billions of galaxies. It's impressive in one sense. On another sense, my take is it's only a four-dimensional space, 11 dimensions if you think about string theory. It's pretty trivial. This is a small number of dimensions, and it falls apart at, we know, at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It gives up. Our space-time just ceases to make any sense at a very, very shallow 10 to the minus 33, not 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, just 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. It falls apart. So there's another sense in which our sentience and our range of experiences, to me, I'm not terribly impressed, frankly. And my guess is that there are sentient beings that look on us as the same way we look on amoebas. It's like, I'm glad I'm not that dumb and that limited, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think that we tend to think of man as the measure of all things, and I tend to think of us as pretty low on the totem pole in terms of the potentials. Why not having a headset that has a trillion dimensions? Why be stuck with four? Why not a trillion? There's lots of problems I'm interested in solving where I want to imagine and visualize a geometric structure in just like four dimensions. I can't do it. I feel then I actually feel cheated. Like I can't even imagine a four-dimensional structure. Now, how dumb is that? I want an upgrade. So anyway, yeah. So the long answer is yes. I think there are sentient beings that are much upgraded compared to us.
Right. Yeah, so you mentioned your theory of conscious agents, and one of the things that I really love about it when I first read about it is that it provides a model which actually points to there being one consciousness, because that's the fundamental idea of non-duality. It's just one consciousness or one reality, and that's what we are. So the question for a lot of people coming to this teaching is, how can I know that? They say, oh, experience seems to tell me there's lots of different completely separate consciousnesses, and it's quite a block for many people. So I felt that your theory provides a potential way through that block. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
That's right. It came as a surprise to me because I was working with my colleagues Chetan Prakash and Bruce Bennett and some other colleagues on a mathematical model of consciousness, and all we tried to do is write down as simple a mathematical formulation as possible. Right? In science, you want the minimal assumptions that can give you the maximal explanation. And so we wrote down this very, very simple mathematical structure that we call a conscious agent. And we could prove that it was computationally universal. So even though it didn't explicitly have a notion of a self or learning or memory or problem solving or intelligence, we knew that our simple definition of a conscious agent, we could build networks of conscious agents that had learning and memory, problem solving, intelligence, and selves if we wanted. So we knew that we could boot up a very rich theory of consciousness and all of its facets from this very, very simple definition of a conscious agent. And that's sort of the goal in science, the simplest starting point. And it was not until months or years later that looking at the definition, I realized, oh wow, okay. Well, when I have two agents interacting, the two agents together satisfy the definition of a conscious agent. So they are a conscious agent. That's the rule of the game, right? Anything that satisfies your definition is a conscious agent. So then I realized any collection of conscious agents, even if they're not interacting, satisfy the definition. So that blew me away. And what it means then is, suppose I start with a whole bunch of conscious agents, like an infinity of them, agent 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to as big as you want. So that is what we call a countable infinity, and it's the smallest infinities. There are many, as you well know, there are many different sizes of infinity. So that's the smallest. So if we start off with that one, then it turns out if you look at the possible combinations of these agents, all possible combinations, you do the math, it's a bigger infinity. It's called Aleph 1. So the first one is called Aleph 0. The next infinity is called Aleph 1. So, but now that we have an Aleph 1 number of agents, you can look at all their combinations. And now it's Aleph 2. And this is called Cantor's hierarchy of infinities. And so it's true that any collection of agents is one agent. But as you start to say, okay, well, how many collections are there? Well, there's Aleph 0, Aleph 1, Aleph 2, and it goes all the way, it never stops. We can talk about Aleph infinity, but there's no such thing as Aleph infinity, because all that means is there's no end to this hierarchy of infinities. It's infinitely long, you can never get there. So you get this. So the math takes your head to a remarkable place that I still haven't been able to wrap myself completely around. It blows my mind. So maybe I don't have the deep understanding that Francis Lucille is talking about. Maybe I'm still stuck in a headset understanding of this. But let me give you that understanding. It's true that there's only one, and it's also true because any combination of them is also a one agent. But it's also true that you can never get to the end of this combination process. It's limitless. So this gives me this feeling, the best I can think about it right now with my limited, right, I was saying I need an upgrade, and this is one reason I want an upgrade, to try to wrap my head around these things, because it looks like the one consciousness is one, and yet never, from my limited point of view, it's always dynamic. In some sense, you can never get to the end. The possible. So you can see that there's this. It's a theorem that there's one, and it's also true, at least from my own perspective right now, that I can never grasp all there is no end to the combinations. So it gives me a feeling of the one agent, but a deep dynamism that's in principle never ending, and yet it is one, and yet it's dynamic and always growing, and yet it is just one. They all seem to be true, and if I had an upgrade, I could understand. If my brain had an upgrade, I could understand. But that's what the math is saying, and so it does lead to to me it's a profound experience to realize how limited my understanding is. So people say that you can never understand God or the ultimate one. Here's a concrete way in which I can't understand it, and it comes out of my own theory. And so that's good, and it's humbling, very, very humbling.
It's absolutely beautiful, really lovely. And the other thing that really struck me was that your theory also allows for the possibility of awareness without content. So you have awareness with all content and awareness without content, and that's such an important part also of this non-dual teaching.
It is, and I can't claim any credit because I wasn't trying to do that. It was
Mm.
when I was just trying to write down, I was focused on the experiences, right? The concrete experiences that you could have as consciousness. So
Mm.
that's what I was trying to capture with the conscious agent thing. I wasn't really trying to capture awareness without content. So we wrote down this mathematics, and again, I'm slow, but a few months later, maybe a couple of years later, I was looking at the math, and I realized that there was a part of the math that I hadn't thought about before. And I realized that the right, a natural intuition of that, or interpretation of it, was that corresponds to awareness without content. And I can just say what it is. So when you talk about probabilities of things happening, right? So for example, just a simple, I'm going to flip a coin twice. I could get, and you want to ask, say, what's the probability of getting, say, two heads or something like that? So if you want to ask that kind of question, what you learn in your probability classes is first you have to write down all the possible outcomes. So you write down what's called a probability space. So the probability space is okay, if I don't flip, nothing happens. So that's called the empty set. So that's one, that's got to be in the possible outcomes, the empty set. Then there could be two heads or two tails, or heads and tails, or tails and heads. So you write down those five possibilities. Nothing happened, two heads, and so forth. So there's like a five outcome space or something like that. Of course, that mathematical structure is sitting there. Now you have to do the experiment, right? When you actually do the experiment, you're going to get an outcome.
Yeah.
But so that mathematical structure that we call the probability space is sitting there. It's telling you the potential for any possible experimental outcome. Now, in the case of conscious experiences, I had to do the same thing. So I have a conscious agent, and it has, say, 2 billion possible conscious experiences. So I need to write down a probability space for all the possible experiences and sequences of, and also sequences of conscious experiences that they could have. So I write down this huge probability space. That probability space is, again, just the potential for the experiences to happen. Now I have to actually have, real experiences happening. But that potential is the deep structure that you have to write down first. And I realized, again, I was slow, but I realized months later, whoa, that must be corresponding to what we call awareness without any particular content. And then what the spiritual traditions are talking about is there's this deep awareness without content, and the experiences just sort of appear and disappear from that awareness. And that's so it took me a long time, but I realized I was forced to write down math which corresponds exactly with what these spiritual traditions are saying, because that was the simplest and the right mathematical thing to do, at least in the first stage. I mean, I'm sure that there's going to be deeper. You and I have talked about category theory. This is probabilistic, so we can move it to categories, but I suspect that we'll see the same thing as we go to categories and so forth. We'll see that there's this structure that corresponds to the potentials, and that would then match what spiritual traditions are talking about is this unlimited awareness without any particular content. But what we really, in some sense, are is that deep potential, and then the conscious experiences are playing that pop out of our potential. So yeah, and the math surprised me on this, and it is profound. Once again, when you write down math in scientific theories, one reason you do it is because then your theory becomes your teacher, right? I didn't know when I was writing down the math that it would teach me that this structure could correspond to awareness without. I had no idea, but it came back and taught me. And even someone as smart as Einstein, when he wrote down his theory of gravity, right? And he's an absolute genius. It took him several years of hard work to take his intuitions and turn them into mathematics. He had the brilliant idea that was the centerpiece of his theory, like in 1907, but it took him until 1915 before he could get the mathematics right and take his intuition. And so he struggled, and he was Einstein. He struggled for all those years. He learned the math and made the theory. A year later, a German scientist named Schwarzschild wrote back to Einstein and said, he found a solution to Einstein's equations, which we now call black holes. Einstein didn't know that there were black holes, and he didn't like it, and he actually disbelieved in black holes. He tried to get rid of them in his theory for a long time. It turned out that Einstein had to become a student of his own mathematics. And that's why we do mathematical theories in sciences, because when you write, I've learned all sorts of things from this theory of conscious agents that I didn't know when I wrote down the theory. I am now a student of my theory. I am not the teacher of the theory. I am the student. And I sit at its feet and learn from it on a daily basis. So that's what happens when you let go of imprecise language, make it very precise in mathematics. Then all of a sudden you become a student. And your own theory then tells you its limits. Einstein's theory, because it's precise, when you combine it with quantum theory, tells you, I stop at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. I no longer make sense. Everyday casual natural language can't do that. And that's why we go to mathematics, because it tells you the limits of your ideas. And it's, again, a great antidote to dogmatism.
Yes. Yes, I mean, on the subject of dogmatism, it seems very common to regard scientific consensus as absolute truth, especially among non-scientists, but also even some scientists, whereas really it's a set of models which explain and predict experience and also teach you things like about the unfolding patterns of nature as we experience them. And the same really applies to spiritual teachings. We shouldn't take the sayings and the analogies or the metaphors of the sages as truth. They just point us to an experience that is, as you say, beyond words. So the question then arises, is there anything we can know for certain?
Well, I agree with the points you just made, Jenny, that on the science side, there is no theory of everything. So people talk about a theory of everything. And most scientists, when they talk about a theory of everything, it's with a wink and a nod. Right? So it's the theory of everything we've got so far. But the genuine scientist would be the first to tell you that in principle we can never have a theory of everything, because there's something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And basically, if your theory is sophisticated enough, rich enough to do arithmetic, then it's going to be incomplete. And most of our scientific theories are that sophisticated. So we know that they're incomplete. And so another way to put it is the scientific theories always make assumptions. And so your theory doesn't explain the assumptions, so it's not a theory of everything. It had to make those assumptions. It doesn't explain them, so there you go. It's not a theory of everything. And every scientific theory makes assumptions. So that's the simple way of pointing out there's no theory of everything. So we're, and I agree with you, in spiritual traditions, they've been saying, the Buddhists say the finger pointing to the moon is not the moon, it's just a pointer. And so, but you're right that there are some non-scientists who don't understand this, and some scientists who don't understand it, who think that, what our current theories are the final word, and just get on board, or you're Luddite. And what my attitude is, if we look back at science a century ago, we look back and we say, we've made a lot of progress. And anybody who thought the science of a century ago was the final word was sadly mistaken. And yes. It takes very little imagination to now go ahead a century and say, okay, it's 2022. So in 2122, they'll look back on us and go, those dunces, they thought they had the final word. We've discovered so many astonishing new things that they would have loved to know if they had just been open enough to be ready to say, I don't know, I'm ready to learn the next step beyond my current quote unquote theory of everything. So I agree the same thing is going to be true in spiritual traditions. The advantage science has is that because we have mathematically precise theories, they will tell us, if we're willing to listen, where they stop. So our theories tell us where they stop. Spiritual traditions haven't had that benefit. We've only had words. which are very, very
Yes.
imprecise. And it's hard for words to tell us precisely where they stop and what are the limits. So, and so it's very easy for us to cling to the words that we heard as a child, for example, or whatever tradition we were brought up in, and to think that that's the final word and the right way to say it. But if we realize that, no, that's just the best we've gotten so far, and humbly open ourselves to the possibility that there could be new pointers that are far more powerful and that could refine pointers in ways that may be uncomfortable, that the pointers that we've been with for decades and have been comfortable with, maybe there'll be new pointers that might be uncomfortable to us, and we have to be open to that discomfort. I mean, for example, in science, when we went from Newton to quantum theory, it was very, very uncomfortable. People are still coming to terms with that. It hurts the imagination. It hurts our standard understanding. But if you are open to it, you learn and you get comfortable with the new way of. And I think that's what maybe consciousness is about: is don't get attached to any one particular kind of pointer. Use the pointers as pointers to the deeper awareness, the understanding that in Francis Lucille's deep sense of understanding. But don't get attached to any pointer. So I would agree with you completely on both points.
Yes, and that's really why this podcast is called "Living in Not Knowing." It's a quote from Jean Klein, "Living Not Knowing." So one of the things he meant a lot of things by that, I think, but one of the things he meant was that I know what I am, but I know that I am, but I don't know what I am, because as soon as you say I am consciousness, then you are limiting yourself. You're limiting to yourself to something that isn't properly defined.
I couldn't agree more. And having that attitude, then it makes you realize that in some sense, even when you're doing it with science, science can never get at the thus I am. It can only give partial what I ams, but not the ultimate I
Not the
am.
ultimate, yes.
That's not the ultimate I am. And
Yeah.
and yet here we are. We are the I ams, and the I ams seem to need to use language and even science as part of their self partial understanding, not the total understanding. And somehow I have a feeling that that's deeply connected with this other thing we were talking about, which is there's no limit to all the infinities of
Mhm.
combinations of agents that are always the one, and that's never ending as a dynamic. And maybe one expression of that dynamic is all these partial understandings that we enjoy. We know that they're only partial, and yet they're not irrelevant. And that's the interest. They're
Mm.
not the final truth, and yet they're not irrelevant. It's almost like consciousness looking at itself through a particular perspective, taking a perspective on itself, and saying, "Oh, well, that's okay. Now a new perspective." And my guess is that this perspective is a particularly simple one. It's only a four-dimensional thing. So we got a cheap headset that consciousness is looking at itself through. Hopefully next time we'll have a more interesting headset. But this is just, so there's this interesting dynamic that it is in some sense trivial compared to the reality of the one consciousness, and yet it's not irrelevant. And there is some point to taking that trivial look at myself, and then another trivial look, and another trivial look. So and that's as far as I've gotten on that. I think that that's a baby step. I need a lot. I want to understand that whole area a lot deeper.
Do you have any thoughts, ideas on how science and spirituality can work together on that?
Yes, I think that we're at a transition period. Science has been physicalist for centuries. the assumption that space and time or space-time is fundamental has been a working hypothesis for almost all of science. And a lot of people think that it's identical to science, but it's not. It's just a theory that scientists have been using for centuries. But it's not the same thing as science. But many scientists don't understand that. Many scientists think that if you don't do a physicalist kind of science, then you're not a real scientist. But now our best scientists are telling us that space and time are not fundamental. As I mentioned earlier, that space-time is doomed, as some physicists are saying. So physicalism is actually provably false by science. So science has shown that its fundamental assumption for the last 3 centuries is false. And that's the beauty of science, is that it showed that one of its deeply held assumptions is deeply false. So going forward, I think that opens the door for scientists to step out of the physicalist headset and the physicalist mindset. And if we do that, all of a sudden, we'll see a lot of spiritual people who say, welcome to our era. We've been here for centuries. We've been here for millennia. We knew for a long time that space and time were not fundamental. But here's the thing. So the spiritual traditions have been there for thousands of years. The scientists are now proving that they're right, that the space and time are not fundamental. And there'll be an exodus from physicalism among the sciences, but it'll take a while. It's not going to happen this decade. It's going to take several decades, I think. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it happens much more quickly. But it'll take a while for most scientists to really recognize that it's over for physicalism. And so then the question comes to the scientists, what is beyond space-time? And the spiritual traditions will say, well, we have some ideas. We have things like awareness and conscious experiences and so forth. And so the two have different parts of the puzzle. I think that the mystics, the spiritual traditions, have a genuine part of the puzzle. I think that they're onto something when they say that there's consciousness and awareness. There's something beyond space-time, and those are the right kinds of ideas and words to use for it. But the scientists have another piece of the puzzle. They have the new technology of mathematical models and hard-nosed experiments that they used to understand our headset, right? Space-time is just our headset. So science has only studied our headset. That's all it's done. Except in the last 10 years, we've taken our first baby steps in science outside of the headset. We have theories now of structures outside of space-time, like the amplituhedron and so forth. And the theory I'm doing of conscious agents. These are theories outside of space-time. So we're taking our first baby step. So we have the two groups that have been at odds for a long time, especially since Galileo. They've been at odds. But now we realize that each side realizes that the other has an important part of the puzzle. Scientists have these new technical tools that the spiritual traditions have not had. The spiritual traditions have meditation, which is a tool that many scientists have not had. And they have the intuitions and the insights that have come from meditating outside of space-time, exploring outside of space-time. So we have a lot from both sides to learn from each other, and a lot that we're going to have to let go on both sides, right? The scientists are having to let go of their physicalism. And as I said, I think it's going to take them decades, because that's a hard one to let go of. Yeah. For many scientists, they feel if I let go of physicalism, I'm letting go of science. They're not. Science is mathematically precise theories, not physicalist theories. And mathematically precise theories tell us that physicalism is false. So, in fact, it's our physicalist theories that tell us that they're false. So when we start turning to the spiritual side, what they're going to have trouble with, I think, is it's easy to get attached to our pointers, the pointers that we've known and loved. Mm-hmm. And science is going to give new pointers, and it's going to have rapidly evolving pointers. And so it's going to be hard to keep up, because that's what the glory of science is, that once you get into this mode where you're actually using mathematically rigorous pointers, they tell you their limits so quickly that you get then, okay, what's the next one beyond that? And what's the next one beyond that? So things start to evolve. And so you're this smaller understanding that, not the deep understanding that Lucille was talking about, but the smaller, that evolves very, very quickly, and and is a sequence of pointers to the deeper understanding. And so for a lot of us, dogmatism happens because we're not comfortable with the possibility that we're ignorant, or that some of our pointers were only partial pointers, or that some of our pointers were just flat out wrong. There's nothing to save there. And so when
Yeah.
science comes along and says, these pointers, the best we can tell, these pointers are partial and these pointers are just plain pointless. There's going to be, so you can see, it's hard, even among scientists. Scientists are, people, and we get attached to our theories. In many cases, a theory doesn't die until the author of the theory dies, right? and
Yes.
so what we would like to do is have our theories die in our stead. So you can see then the very human side of this with both scientists and spiritual teachers and spiritual practitioners is we get attached to our pointers, even though both sides tell us don't get attached to our pointers. As human beings, we do get attached to them. So that will be always the break that's put onto the whole progress. If we can just let go of our attachment to our pointers, our scientific theories, and our spiritual words, then we can take off.
Yes. All about openness on both sides, isn't it? Really,
Exactly.
it's beautiful. You've mentioned meditation, and I know that you meditate. Can you tell us about that? What led you to start meditating? What method you use?
I started just over 20 years ago because I had trouble sleeping, and I didn't want to take
Oh.
I didn't want to take sleeping aids, pills, because
Mm,
I'm concerned about the addictive things, and I
yeah.
also figured, well, there's some deeper reason why I'm having trouble sleeping. What is the anxiety that's keeping me? So I decided I needed to face that anxiety, and of course I did some counseling, but I realized counseling was good, but I needed to do meditation partly because I had a friend named Joe Arpaia, who was a brilliant a scientist and a student of mine in one of my classes, and he wrote a book on meditation, and so I'd read his book on meditation, which sort of told me that there was. But at the time, I thought I was fine. I gave him feedback on the meditation book, but I didn't meditate. I didn't need it. But when I couldn't sleep, I decided maybe I need it. So I started meditating, and then I realized as I got in, oh no, this is pretty important. I'm really starting to face a lot of stuff in myself and who I am that I didn't know. And so the meditation that I do is silence. So I don't even really use a mantra
Mm.
or anything. I sit in silence, and I'm very, very lax about the position. I don't want to be as few rules as possible. The only rule is don't beat yourself up when you're not silent, because that itself keeps you in non-silence. So just be kind to
Mm.
yourself, and whatever experiences I have in meditation that come up, I acknowledge them and then go back to silence, and then just see the zoo. I mean, it's a zoo of
Mm.
emotions and thoughts and so forth. And to just sit there and smile at the zoo and be, and slowly over 20 years, and because of the sleeping issue, I had to meditate a lot. It wasn't like I set out to be some kind of long meditator, but simply because I would wake up at night and I needed to meditate until I get
Mm.
back to sleep. I've ended up meditating on average about 3 hours a day for 20
Mm.
years, and some days more. So, like again, I take no credit, like I was some spiritual guy that really wanted to go there. No, I just wanted to sleep, and there's nothing more profound than that. And but the result is I realized it's what perhaps the most important thing I've been doing in my entire life was that meditation process, and it really has it's helped my science. It's helped me to open up to these other interpretations about science and open up to this realm beyond space-time. So it contributed to the advances in my scientific work, but also to understand myself just as a human being, and then to understand partially the limits of my understanding of what I am as a human being, and then ultimately to recognize that what I am can't be described at all, and to let go of all description. And that's what really I'm doing in the meditation. When I let go of all thoughts, what I'm really doing is being my true self, which has no description, and I just am. And what I find is that then opens up this access to this incredible intelligence that I can then take back into my science. So if I really want to make progress in the scientific problem that I'm stuck on, of course, do your reading, study the math and so forth, but then let it all go into ultimate silence, because in some sense that is the deeper understanding that Francis Lucille was talking about, that understands everything, but that these my partial understandings trying to get there. And so when I tap into this deeper understanding, then sometimes I get a thimbleful of intelligence out into the lower level understanding that then I can apply in my science. So I do it still to help me sleep, and it does. But now I do it because that's who I am. I am not these stories, and I'm not these thoughts, and I'm not these emotions. I am the deeper reality on which those things play. And recognizing that deeper reality of what I am is not something that you come to by just thinking. You come to it by being it. And so yeah, that I do that, and I think that has really helped me to be less dogmatic, that in my science, and also in what I think I understand about spiritual stuff. I think what I have learned from it is it's really true that anything I say is just a small perspective, and don't be attached to it. Science will find something far deeper. They'll laugh at what my science is. A century from now, it'll be laughed at, hopefully charitably, and all the things that we say as pointers eventually will be laughed at too in the spiritual side, because we'll have much deeper pointers, and just to be good with that. So that's what comes out of the spiritual, the meditation process for me, I think.
Yes, that's beautiful, and it's interesting that that's exactly the same meditation process that Francis Lucille recommends. So that's what I do, and a lot of my friends too. It's beautiful. So perhaps that's a good place to stop. And thank you, Don. This has been such a really great discussion, and I've enjoyed so much talking to you. So thank you.
Thank you. And it was very kind of you to invite me. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And thank you, all of you, for listening.